Hello, and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's episode, I spoke to the insightful and intelligent Chika Unigwe. Her latest novel, The Middle Daughter, is a loose, modern-day retelling of the story of Hades and Persephone from Greek mythology. It's all about patriarchy, abusive relationships, and one woman who manages to break free and find the life of freedom she has always dreamed of. The book left me reeling and experiencing a whole host of very high emotions, so I'm really glad Chika is my guest today. Born in Nigeria, Chika Unigwe is the author of 5 novels, including On Black Sister Street and Night Dancer. Her short stories and essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, and many other journals. Her works have been translated into several languages. A recipient of several award fellowships, she lives and works in the USA. Her latest novel, The Middle Daughter, has been published by Canongate Books in the UK in 2023. Now, just a little trigger warning before we begin with the show. This episode features talk about grief and loss, sexual abuse, domestic violence. So if any of these things are too difficult for you to listen to right now, please come back to this episode at another time that suits you best. Hello, Chika. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. Thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm well, a bit sleepy, but I'm fine. Thank
You've
you.
been writing for quite a few years. You've got a number of books that have been published, and I'm sure you've worked on loads and loads of writing projects. Did you always know that you wanted to be a writer?
I think I always wanted to be a writer. In the home that I grew up in Enugu in Nigeria, there is probably a collection of old diaries from when I was, 8, 9 years old, in which I wrote all of my stories and poems. So I did always want to be a writer. And I also had the really good fortune of being classmates with Flora Nwapa's daughter in elementary school, in second grade. And so Flora Nwapa was the first African woman to be published in English. And she was published in her first book, Efuru, was published in, I want to say 1966. But by the time I was in elementary school, she had her own publishing house. She was doing children's books. And I remember her coming to our classroom one day. I think she had a conference with my teacher. And to keep us busy, she gave us like books from her publishing house, and she gave us coloring books. And I was such in awe of this woman who lived in Nigeria, who lived in Enugu where I lived, whose daughter was in my class, but who was doing the same kind of thing that people like Enid Blyton and all the other European authors I had been reading as a child were doing.
Wow, that sounds amazing. So it sounds like from a young age you had like a real life example and like someone who could show you what was possible, and I guess beyond as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I remember being in high school and writing a novel and finding Flora Nwapa's phone number and calling her up and saying that I had a novel that I wanted published. And she was so kind as to tell me to bring it into her publishing house and she would take a look at it. And for so many reasons, I never could. And then we went back to school because I was in boarding school. And by the time I came back the next year, I had sort of outgrown the novel. And I had started on something else.
Oh, that's so lovely. And yeah, I mean, it sounds incredibly, I guess, like generous of her as well, to have given so much time and like kindness. I think children.
Absolutely. I mean, she was extremely kind. She didn't have to talk to me. She didn't have to take my call. She didn't have to offer to look at something that I'm sure she knew was crap, because I mean, what did I know to write at that age anyway? But yeah. But I've never forgotten that kindness.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it sounds definitely like something that must have stayed with you. So what was your writing journey actually like? Like, how did you go from this like budding writer as a teenager into now a published, very, very good published author as well?
Yeah. So I had, like, I've been so blessed with really supportive network. And so as a child, it didn't matter what I wrote. My parents were my cheerleaders, even from when I thought that publishing was just typing out things. So I'll write things and I'll give it to my dad and say, oh, I just wrote a book of poems. And then he would give it to his secretary to type out for me. So they never mocked my dreams. And twice a year would go to the country home, which is our ancestral home in Osumeni. And there, we didn't get electricity until late 70s. And so even though we had electricity then, but we were so far from any town, right? And I remember telling my father that I wanted to write a book during one of my extended holidays there. And I thought that writing a book meant having a typewriter. And now, as a grown up, I can only imagine the length to which he went to seek out a typewriter for me and typing sheets and everything I needed to just, to make me happy and to get me to write my book. And then when I was in college, I wrote a collection of poems, and my father paid to have them published. And he threw me a book launch,
Oh my goodness.
And I think that sort of having that kind of support made me think that I could, I don't know, I think it's important to mention it because it's at the very beginning of me imagining myself as a writer. And, and he threw me a book launch, his friends came, it was really, really nice. And then I got married in college. And after my final exams, I moved. My husband is Belgian. He moved to Belgium and I moved with him. And I was in this place where the English I knew didn't really matter. I didn't have a community around me. I was writing in English, but I was sort of all alone. And I sent out a short story to the BBC, to a BBC short story competition, and it won a prize. And the story was broadcast on the BBC, and it was so affirming, right? It was really affirming for me. And then I wrote 2 books, and I wrote a collection of folk tales, and I looked up Macmillans on I looked up Macmillans on the internet, and I sent the editor this, I think it was a 300-page collection of folk tales, and it was a grandmother telling these folk tales to her grandchildren. And the editor wrote back to me and said, this seems like a labor of love, but we don't really publish, stuff like this. But we're looking for someone to write readers for children. And if you were able to do that, we could publish that. And so I wrote 2 readers for Macmillans, one for, I think, second graders and one for 13-year-olds, and they published them. And then I entered for a short story competition in Belgium. I found a flyer in Antwerp at a book fair, and it was supposed to be in Dutch. And I, wrote my first short story in Dutch, and it was a good story, but it was terrible Dutch. And it won a prize, and the publisher called me up and asked if I was writing a novel and that they'll be interested in looking at it. And at the same time, I think it was the same year that I got shortlisted for the King Prize Award. Anyway, cut a long story short, that was like really the Macmillans was my first foray into, really publishing, where I had a contract and I was paid. And then the novel that the Dutch publishers bought and translated into Dutch and published was like really my very first, foray into adult writing.
I really loved hearing about how your parents, and I think especially your father, encouraged you as a child, especially because I've spoken to a number of authors who've all kind of said, growing up, I didn't really believe that writing was like a job. Like I didn't believe that I could be a writer. I kind of felt like that maybe there's something I'm good at and something I could do on the side. It never occurred to me that this is something that I could do like with my life. And I think, and these are people from like all different communities and backgrounds. And it's something that really resonates with me because growing up, I also, I didn't really think that writing or being a writer either that it was possible or that it was like an actual thing. I thought that kind of maybe it was something that people did on the side. And it wasn't until I
Yeah,
was like a
yeah.
little bit older that I had a better understanding. And so I can imagine like it would have felt so empowering and just helped you feel so almost like certain in your path, knowing that from the
No,
beginning it felt like
absolutely.
something that was well within reach.
Absolutely. I mean, my so it wasn't just my father. It was, it was my
Mm,
mother as well. They would read anything I wrote, and they would make, such a big deal, such a big deal of it, and it was really
mm,
affirming, superbly
mm,
affirming. I don't know that I would have had the courage to have continued
mm,
writing if they had mocked my dreams. They made it seem like very valid. It was as valid as any other
mm.
dream, and they made me think that it was possible.
Absolutely. And so you've obviously you said that you were also writing in Dutch, but you were also obviously like writing in English. And so you've been writing for a good number of years now. How do you feel like you as a writer in terms of your style and your voice and what really matters to you, how that has changed or maybe not, how that has changed over the years?
Well, I hope it's evolved, but I think I'm a much more fearless writer than I was when I
Mm,
began. I think when I started writing, I had a lot of doubts and fears. I mean, those doubts are still there. I don't think that there's any writer who can claim to write without any doubts
mm,
whatsoever, because you're doing this thing on your own, but then the final product belongs to people over whose interpretation of your writing you have no control
mm,
over, right? And so the doubts are always there. But I think I care less about, what other people might think of the
mm,
writing. I know that how they interpret my writing is not on me, it's on them.
absolutely.
And I think that's the way that my writing has changed. And I think one of the people that also influenced the way that my writing has grown is my editor. Well, she was my editor with On Black Sister Street, and she was also my editor with The Middle Daughter, Ella Wakatama. And so when we were working when I was working on Black Sister Street, I remember Ella telling me, just assume knowledge. Don't try to explain everything. You know, what people don't know, they will find
Mm,
out. And that was just so
mm,
liberating. She said, just because if you don't assume knowledge, if you're constantly trying to explain, it shows in your
mm,
writing, right? And the writing sort of becomes tilted. So that's also another way in which my writing has
mm,
evolved, that I've learned to assume knowledge. I've learned to be bolder in the choices that I
mm.
make, and to imagine that whatever audience I have, that they're an audience that I don't have to explain anything
Mm.
to, because then it leaves me a lot freer to write.
That's so interesting, and it's something that I think a lot about as a reader as well. That if I've picked up a book and if there's a reference in there that I don't understand, I shouldn't be expecting the author to spell it out to me. I have a like the capacity and I have almost like a duty myself to look it up, or
Absolutely.
sometimes a lot of the time I have found that you can understand something just in the context of what you're reading. I think it's very easy to not understand like a word for word, say like a translation of a word or a practice or some whatever it may be. I think it's very easy to figure it out kind of if you just keep reading. If you close yourself off to that and feeling frustrated that the author hasn't given it to you on a plate, I feel like you lose so much.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that as a writer you try to do is to make sure that everything is understood in in the context of the writing, right? And that it's more important that you understand the emotional truth than that you get the preciseness you know
Absolutely.
of a word.
Absolutely.
um
Absolutely. And the thing I believe so fiercely in is that writers are telling a story. So they're telling a story, or they're
Absolutely.
giving a message, or they're presenting fact, whatever it is that they're doing. And their aim, and I guess their responsibility, is to share that story with us. It does not need to be a story that is palatable to the English speaker or
Mm-hmm.
like massively only understood and only told in words that are English and in references that the West will
Mm-hmm.
understand. That's not what this is about. Where we want to hear the stories the authors have to say, and they're going to tell it to us in a way that is authentic, genuine, and that makes sense to the
Mm-hmm.
story in and of
Absolutely.
itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And obviously, the publishing world, and I think the world more generally, is changing at such a rapid pace. Like the
Mm-hmm.
role of social media, and I guess
Mm-hmm.
in relation to that, kind of the relationship that authors have with their readers and with the communities has also changed. How do you navigate such such a changing world in terms of also like what's expected of you as a person, but also in terms of the stories that you're
Mm-hmm.
telling?
That's a very interesting question because I was thinking of this recently about how when I started writing, so occasionally I would get letters from students who were reading a story that I wrote and who'd been asked by their professors to try to get in touch with the author and ask questions. But now I'm very big. I really love Twitter. I'm on, well, I guess we call it X now, Xstar, X Twitter. Elon Musk has changed the name, but I'm really big on Twitter. I'm really big on Twitter. I love Twitter, and I love it because it reduces the barrier between the reader and the writer. And I have people like commenting on my work and getting in touch with me, asking me direct questions. And I love that engagement. I love the immediacy of the engagement, but I'm also very careful not to explain things. I think maybe I probably be able to explain this better with an illustration. So in the middle daughter, something happens to the protagonist that some people have said, well, this can never happen. It's not, someone said, oh, it's not very believable that she would do,
Mm.
ABC because I wouldn't do it,
Mm.
right? I had to fight the temptation to say, well, actually, this is the truest part of the novel in the sense that it was taken from a real
Mm.
life incident. And then I caught myself going like, no, the fact that it is true within the novel should be
Mm.
enough. I don't have to use real life incidents to buffer or to illustrate a point in the novel. Don't know if that makes sense. Yeah. So I love that immediacy, but there is also the temptation for authors to try to explain
Mm.
themselves. I think that all the explanation somebody needs is in the
Mm.
novel, right? It's not in it's not in me telling you that this did happen to
Mm.
someone. It's enough that in the novel it makes
Mm.
sense that it happened to the protagonist in the novel, and that within the world of the novel, it is
Mm.
logical.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's so true because in our everyday lives, we will meet people that are doing things or making certain decisions that we personally
Mm-hmm.
are not doing or feel as though if we
Mm-hmm.
were in their situation we wouldn't do. And I feel like we
Mm-hmm.
don't always impose that same harsh critic. I mean, I guess it depends on what the situation is, but often we accept that people make different choices and we may not agree with it and we may sympathize or not. But I feel like when it comes to literature, people can be very angry about why is this
Yeah.
character doing something that I would not do or
Yeah.
I don't
Mm-hmm.
agree with.
Yeah. And I think it's great because literature is supposed to make you
Yes,
feel.
exactly.
So when people say, I'm really angry with this protagonist, I'm like, yes, I've
Yes.
done a
Oh
good
my
job.
God.
What I don't want to do is leave you lukewarm. I want you to feel one way or the other, right? I want you to be so angry, but then you keep on reading,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. And reading
Yeah.
your book, I mean, I'm not the only person who has felt an immense amount of rage while reading your latest book, The Middle Daughter. Like
Yeah.
an immense
Mm-hmm.
amount of rage. I think
Mm-hmm.
throughout almost the entire book, maybe there was like 10 pages in the
Mm-hmm.
whole book where I was not feeling angry. The rest of the book, I was
Yeah.
livid, absolutely livid.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
so The Middle Daughter
Thank you.
The Middle Daughter is, I believe, actually, I have read that it's a retelling of a Greek myth. And I just
Mm-hmm.
wondered if you could talk a little bit about what The Middle Daughter is about and what you sought to do with this modern
Mm-hmm.
retelling.
Mm-hmm. So the middle daughter is a very loose reimagining of the myth of Hades and Persephone. And one of the things that really upset me about the original myth is that there are versions in which Persephone Persephone accepts the validity of Hades' abduction, and she believes that she's in a relationship with this god who's, abducted her. And I wanted a retelling where my Persephone character never accepts the validity of that relationship. She's always aware that this is an abduction. I'm in this relationship not of my own free will, and I will get out of it someday. And I also wanted her to have a bit more agency. And I also, so it was, I wanted to avenge Persephone, I think, in a way. I wanted the Hades character to also be punished, right, in some way. And I think I was also drawn to the myth because it remains timely, right? So this very, you're a god, you can have anything you want. You see this girl, you like her, and it doesn't matter what she thinks. You want her because you want her, and you take her because you want her. And it doesn't matter what she thinks. She doesn't have to reciprocate your wanting. And that always fascinated me. And I wanted to imagine what it would be like in our modern society, especially in Nigeria, in a patriarchal society, what that would look like. And I wanted to explore the abduction and the rape, the sexual abuse. I wanted to explore that, and how power dynamics determine how we talk about these things and how we deal about these issues in our society.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really interesting because obviously the original Greek myth is about abduction and then kind of like holding someone. She's like basically held hostage. I think in the retelling, she's literally like, I think like trapped and whatnot. And just to think about that in a modern day context, but also within a Nigerian society context, the idea that you can be trapped in a place, you can feel as though you have no choice but to stay with an abuser because there is nothing in society to protect you, because you have no form of independence or empowerment. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of exploration of this, of being stuck somewhere. And I think it plays out in so many different ways for people in all kinds of different situations. But I wondered, like, what for you that exploration was really about.
Yeah, I think that I also wanted to, because very often we think of the women who get into this kind of situations as a particular kind of women, and I wanted to show that it could happen to anyone. It doesn't matter how much education you have or how much wealth you have. We tend to think that it happens to women in lower class situations without any education. And while I was revising the novel, a Nigerian doctor made a video that went viral where she was talking about her husband, both sexually and physically assaulting her and beating her. She made this, and as she was making this video, her since she was carrying a baby, and then her young son was sort of playing around in the sitting room. It was very confrontational. And she was talking about how her husband, who was a journalist that people knew, and these people were young and educated, both of them, upper middle class, and how the husband beat her like right after she had her new baby by C-section because she asked him about a woman. He was sending money to some woman, and it was such a very sad video. And people were on social media calling out the husband, and maybe not even 2 weeks later, the governor of her state and his wife held a very public reconciliation for for this couple. And the governor's wife kept referring to this girl as her younger sister and said, marriages, everybody has issues in marriages. Don't listen to people telling you to leave your husband. And my husband has spoken to him and he will never do this again. And you've got children. And she went back to this man and then she wrote a really lengthy Facebook post and put it on Facebook, telling everybody, all you feminists who want me to leave my husband, just back out of my marriage. This is between myself and my husband. And it was just so sad. It was so sad to see how she was sort of coerced into going back to this abuser. And it's not like she could not leave. It's not as if she didn't have financially she could leave. She had the money to leave. She had a job. She could look after herself. She could look after her kids. There was really nothing for her to. There's no financial reason for her to stay, which is also what we tend to think of women like that. Like, some women can't leave because the husband is the breadwinner. No, she was earning more than her husband. And yet society forced her to stay, right? Yeah, I just thought it was very confrontational for me to be watching this and for this to be playing out while I was, revising the novel about somebody in a similar, situation.
Yeah, because I guess it just goes back to this idea of coercion. You don't have to lock somebody in a room to force them to do something.
No. No, absolutely
exactly.
not.
If you leave somebody, one, with no option, but if you guilt them into doing something because of, you can have cultural factors and things that make people do certain things, and religious elements, and then family connections. It's very, very complex and very, very multi-layered.
Absolutely. And that was also what I wanted to explore in the middle daughter with Nani's situation. Some people have said that they're very livid with Nani's mother. How do you leave your daughter like this? And I'm always very tempted to say, Nani's mother is also a product of her society. Nani's mother really does she loves her children. She really does love her children. But when love intersects with obligation and duty, right, especially cultural duties, very often duties and obligations will outweigh or will influence the way that love plays out, right? Some years ago, there was a Nigerian man, and I don't remember what part of Nigeria this happened, but his 15-year-old daughter was raped by their tailor, right? She went to pick up something from the tailor, clothes from the tailor. The tailor sexually assaulted her, and she came back and she told her parents. And her father took the tailor to court. And what he wanted was for the judge to mandate that the tailor would marry his daughter because he had defiled the daughter.
My goodness.
And so he didn't do this because he did not love his daughter. He was actually doing this out of love for the daughter. Because he said, you've defiled her, right? And the only way to expunge that defilement is for you to do right by her and marry her. Because now that you've done this to her, everybody knows she's no longer a virgin. Who is going to marry her? And so the way that we show love is also influenced by our cultures and by society. And so for this father, his way of showing how deeply he loved his daughter was by getting the man that he believed had taken something away from her to give it back to her, to restore her social standing in their society. Because as far as he was concerned, in his society, and maybe, rightfully so, in the society that he lives in, that it was better to have a married daughter than to have a daughter who'd been raped and left aside, right? Which is also why the way that we talk about sexual assault matters a lot. Because if we talk about it in terms of a woman being defiled, then the burden is on the woman to be undefiled, right? There is no mention at all on the so it's on the victim to be undefiled. And how do you go about removing the defilement, right? in this case, it's not by making sure the man goes to court, it's by making sure this abuser marries your daughter. And I don't even want to think of what that marriage must be like, because now you've given this man even more power. He knows that without him, your daughter is
Exactly.
nothing. And you've also told young men that all they have to do is, go out and rape any woman that they like, and then they can do right by her by marrying her, and her family would accept. So I wanted to look at the way in which, our society, the things we believe in, the things we hold dear, our norms and our traditions affect the ways in which we handle sexual abuse cases, and how the victims view themselves, and how the abusers also view themselves.
Yeah, I mean, although I was very angry while reading the book, I was also very sad. Like, I felt for a lot of the book, because obviously, like, there is a happy ending, but for a lot of the book, I just felt so incredibly sad for Nani, because she was going through hardship after hardship, abuse after abuse, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and it felt as though she had nobody on her side. She couldn't confide in her sister. She couldn't turn to her mother. Like, there was a very complex relationship going on there. That was like, there were lots of things happening with that. And it was just very sad. And it made me really think about how many women around the world are living in a situation that is something similar to that.
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I had a friend whose sister was in a very abusive relationship for so many years, and they didn't know about it because she was too ashamed to tell her parents, too ashamed to tell her family, too ashamed to tell her siblings. And it wasn't until eventually the man kicked her out that she told them the truth. And she said, she said that her sister said she felt as if a weight had been lifted off her, because this man finally gave her the permission to leave. And once she left, she couldn't understand why, or her sisters couldn't understand why she didn't leave earlier. She said she was just, because abuse can do, it can cause havoc to your emotional state, and you feel so powerless, right? And it's not because you don't feel powerless because you don't have any power. You feel powerless because you don't see any, you're too blinded to see a way out. I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. In the book, not only do we have this case of abduction, I guess, and abuse and we also have a lot of grief. So our protagonist of Nani, she loses her sister, and then a couple of years later she loses her father. Really, really tragic. You give this really beautiful line which says that the thing about grief is that things die so that they can return. And it's an idea that, like, when we lose something, we are able to, like, find something else, or something else will come and it will replace. And it's just a really, really beautiful way, I thought, of looking at loss and looking at grief.
Thank you.
Why did you decide to include an element of grief in the story? And also, because obviously Nani is the middle daughter, so she has an older sister and a younger sister. But then, so when she loses her older sister, she kind of becomes the older sister. She's no longer the middle daughter in that sense, I guess. It was really difficult to read about the breakdown of the family in that way, and the loss that we saw of Nani's character. So yeah, why did you decide to include grief, and what were you hoping to bring out through that?
Yeah, because I'm thinking back to all of my writing, and I think that I'm very much drawn to grief because I have lived away from home for a very long time. I can't remember much of what I wrote before I left home, but I think that one of the things that happens to you when you move, and it doesn't matter why you move. I moved to Belgium because of love, because I fell in love with a Belgian man, and he decided to go home, and I went with him. But when you leave home, especially for a protracted time, and you're moving away from home, it doesn't matter how often you go back to that home, you're losing something. So there's always this So I think that for a very long time, I have been grieving. I grieve the home that I left behind. And every time I go back home, something else has changed. I have changed. My interaction with home too has changed. And one of the things I was very scared of when I moved was that I'll be home and I'll get a phone call that somebody very close to me had died. Because I was far away from everybody else, far away from my siblings who lived in the States then. Then I had two who lived in Nigeria, and then my parents. And I had friends. And I thought, okay, if anything happened to them, I wouldn't even be able to get to them quick enough. I had stories of, I had a friend who was from Senegal and who got a phone call that her father was dying, and she was still in the air when her father died. So by the time she got to Senegal, her father had died. She was too late. And that really bugged me. And for a very long time, I wondered what would happen to me if I were to lose somebody while I was abroad. And every time the phone rang, I got really scared. Oh my goodness, something's happened. Something has happened. It was a very irrational fear, but I think it was a fear that started once I moved away from home. I moved so far away from everybody else. And so I find that I'm very drawn to grief. And my first year in Belgium, I think, my husband's grandmother died. We went for the funeral. My parents were around and my siblings were around. And we went for the funeral. And it was so different from the way that we would, it was just, the rituals were so different from what we were used to, right? It was so quiet. People weren't screaming and crying like a human being had died. My mother-in-law and her sisters and her siblings, it was so, I don't know, they just had handkerchiefs and they were dabbing their eyes. And then we went to, it's called the coffee table in Dutch. So we went to the coffee table afterwards for the repast, and it was coffee and tea and sandwiches, and people were just talking and laughing, and it was over. And she was 99 and a half years old. In my culture, if a woman that old had died, it would be like a celebration for days. You're not going to have just a one day, coffee and tea and cookies and sandwiches and it's gone. No, you're going to have 5-6 days of celebrations, and then you not bury her. But people are going to cry and shout and ask to be buried with her because the whole human being is gone. And so I also wondered what it must be like to have to lose someone and have to mourn them in a strange tongue, And so I think that the grief in the novel is just part of my ongoing fascination with how people grieve, but also how such monumental loss can affect your whole trajectory, right? Especially in a place like Nigeria, right? Where when you become a widow, something else is expected of you. It is because Nani's mother is a widow that she behaves in certain ways. She's aware of the scrutiny under which society puts people like her. And so she's so determined not to fail in her duties that her determination affects the way that she loves on her children. And I wanted to look at the way that, Nani also needed an ancestor looking out for her, right? And I wanted that ancestor to be someone closer to her age. And even though Nani, Ugo, her sister, lose a sister and lose a father, and her mother loses a husband and loses a daughter, grief is very personal. And the way that they grieve and the way they react to these deaths and what their expectations are, also completely different and unique to each person, right? Yeah. And I wanted to also explore that the ways in which when we grieve, it can lock us in, it can make us really selfish, that we don't really care what other people are doing, even people close to us. Because, you've all lost the same person, but you've lost that person differently. Because the way you're grieving that person is completely different from the way, your sister is grieving that person who is a sibling to the both of you. Yeah.
I thought it was a really beautiful exploration of it. And I I really appreciated how each character was dealing with it differently, and I feel like Nani's mother had like a very kind of almost like a motherly and like a mother figure approach or like response to it, which was like, this is really hard for me, but I'm not going to show that to my children. I'm going to hide my grief. I have to get through everything. I have to get through from day to
Absolutely.
day, and I have to like build a life now without my husband in a society that doesn't value me as a single woman with children.
Yeah.
And there's this bit where Nani is she's very angry that she feels like her mother and her sister are not grieving in the way that she's grieving. And so she feels like, why are you behaving as though you haven't lost anyone? And it's really unfair. It's a very unfair way of looking at things because, as you said, like everyone grieves differently, but also her mother had so much responsibility. Yeah,
Absolutely. But Nani's outburst is also understandable,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
Because grief also makes you really just focus on
Yes,
yourself. You don't have the energy to focus on you don't even have the capacity
exactly.
to focus on other people. It's just
Mm.
you. And you deal with it the way that you want to deal with
Mm.
it. I was in Belgium recently, and one of my very good friends, and I mean they're much older couple, 50 years ago lost their 19-year-old son. So he would have been, no, 40 years ago lost their 19-year-old son. So he would have been
Mm.
59. And I mean, I didn't meet the son, I didn't know him, but apparently up until today, the mother of that son, this is their only child, every at the beginning of every season she brings out all his clothes for that season. So summer season, she brings out all his clothes for the summer, puts away his winter clothes. Winter season, she packs up his summer clothes and brings out his winter clothes. These are clothes from 40 years ago, right, when he was 19. And the husband cannot stand
Mm.
this. And he's done everything. He's gone to therapy. He's like, I think we should move on. And she thinks it's so
Mm.
unfair to ask her to move
Mm.
on. And as an outsider, you're thinking, well, it's been 40 years. To her, it's just yesterday. Her son is still 19 years old. She still talks about him in the present
Mm.
tense. And sometimes you're having a conversation with her, and she would say, oh, my son, likes whatever. She still talks about him in the
Mm.
present tense. He's still there, right? And he's still 19. And probably until the day she dies, she's not going to change. This is the way that she has learned to cope with the grief, by pretending that he's still 19, that he's still there, and that she can still do all these things that she used to do for
Mm.
him. Put out his summer clothes, put out his winter clothes, remind him to, eat his greens and everything else, and have all these conversations with him in
Oh my
her
gosh,
head.
that's
And she doesn't think it's fair that her husband is asking her to move
mm.
on, and that he has done this for the past 40
Mm.
years. And she probably thinks that her husband has very easily forgotten about the
Mm.
son, which is also not true and not fair.
Exactly.
You know.
Exactly. Yeah. That's so heartbreaking. Oh my goodness. So
No, it is
heartbreaking. Yeah, really
absolutely.
sad. And I think as well, I guess grief loss isn't just about the way that we grieve and the way that we feel, but the very real practical ways in which life changes when we lose somebody. And
Absolutely.
in the book, so Nani loses her sister, and she loses her father, and there's a few times when she says like, well, if my father was alive, this would have been okay, and if he was alive, he would have beat him up, and all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
And it's sad, it's
absolutely.
very, very sad, but it just shows you how much your life can completely change when you lose someone that goes way beyond any period of mourning, because
Absolutely. In very tangible
yeah.
ways. I know a family growing up in Nigeria, and their father had just got a
Mm,
job. He was going to move to the
mm,
UK, and he was going to, work for a few years and then bring his family along with him. And then he dies.
mm,
before, I think the week before he's to go, he dies. And suddenly the family lose the breadwinner. I don't know that any of the children eventually went to college, you know. I don't know that any of the children eventually went to university because they couldn't afford it. There are days when I imagine how different their life would have been if the father hadn't died. He would have gone to the UK. He was an engineer, but he hadn't worked for the company that he was employed to work for. So they also had no obligation to the widow and to the kids. So they got nothing, right? So, and I keep, I think of this family. I think there were like 8 of them or so, and just how different their lives would have turned out if their father hadn't died, or if he had, worked for 10 years before he died, or just, so many different scenarios. And Nani's father was a different parent than the mother was. He was maybe a bit more progressive. His attitude to things were completely, different than Nani's mother's attitude to things. And he would have provided that balance, right? But his death also puts Nani in a very vulnerable position. So Nani was really ripe for the picking when Ephraim turns up.
Yes, definitely, because she was so heartbroken. And I guess what she was missing when her father had died was having someone that she could speak to, someone she could vent to. And he kind of filled that gap, even though she said from the beginning, I'm not interested in him, I'm not attracted to him. But he, I guess, he must have known that there was something kind of very vulnerable about her. Which
absolutely. I mean, absolutely. From coming to visit her so often, he exactly knew what buttons to push. And he manipulated that. He manipulated her vulnerability and manipulated her inability to see that her sister and her mother were equally, grieving. He became, and you see this on social media too, right? So somebody comes up and says, oh, my parents don't understand me, and you see, and they give whatever reason that they want to give. And you see 101 people turn up and say, we're here for you. We will be your family. We will be the community. We will be your parents. Don't mind them. Parents are not just biological. Family isn't just biological. We will be your family. I see that playing out and so there will always be people who are willing to fill in the vacuum that you tell them is there for the right reasons and for the wrong reasons. One of the most heartbreaking things I ever read on or followed on Twitter was this woman who she had a quarrel with her mother about something and she posted it. The number of people that were on her timeline telling her, do not forgive your mother, this is emotional abuse, and really validating her decision not to have anything more to do with her mother was so heartbreaking to me as a parent, right? It was super heartbreaking. Also because I went back and I looked at her former, she had a YouTube channel, and I looked at her former channel, I looked at her former posts, her old posts, and saw how close she was with her mother, and she had these videos of herself and her mother doing makeup together. And suddenly people are telling you to throw this, to cancel her, to cancel your mother because whatever it was, I don't remember what it was her mother did, and telling her, we will be your family, we will be your new community, And so it's not just that there are many people like Ephraim. And sometimes you do need people to tell you that they will be your family and they will be your community. But sometimes not everybody wants to be your family for
exactly.
good.
And I think, the harsh reality is that it's very difficult to find people that will be there for you all of the time and through thick and thin, because people have their own lives. Like, it's very difficult to build community. It's not as simple as tweeting, oh, I'm here for you, right? It's not as simple as that. And it takes time and it takes trust and love and friendship and all of these kind of things that it's like very, very complex. So you have, obviously I have mentioned several times that especially the that your book has made me very angry. What was it like for you writing a character that was just so awful? Where did
Yeah,
where did that kind of where did it come from? Because he is horrible. And I feel like if you can make people feel angry, there must have been a lot going on kind of in your writing process. If you can just tell us a little bit about that.
yeah, yeah. Thanks for that question, because we always sort of think that it's reading that makes us empathetic, but I think that writing forces you to
Mm,
empathize as well. Because to be able to write any character
mm,
well, you have to have a lot of respect for that character, whether or not you believe, whether or not you like them or not. It's not a question
mm,
of liking them. You have to write them with integrity. And to be able to do that, at least for me, I have to slip under their skin. I have to be them, you know. And so for every character that I write, I have to be that character. I have to hear that character's voice. I have to believe that that character
mm,
is real, right? And so writing a character like Ephraim, there were days when I just wanted to wash him off of me. I wanted to go just, go take a
mm,
bath. Like, this guy is just taking on me. I can't deal with this today. So it was very difficult because I was, I guess, because I was him for the periods that I was writing him. I couldn't take decisions as a
mm,
writer that might have made him that might have made him
mm,
one sided. Because, yes, he's vile, he's terrible, but he really does believe that he loves
mm.
Nani, right? And he also really does love his children. And that really hurt me. I didn't want his children to reciprocate that love.
Yeah.
you know, I did not want him to be a good parent. I wanted him to be as terrible a parent as he was a man, but I couldn't. He wouldn't let me do that,
Mm,
right? And that was such a painful thing for me to realize that he could be this terrible person, this really vile person, but really be fond of
mm,
his children. That the worst thing you could do to him was to remove his children from him, because he really, 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 really does love those kids.
yeah.
And they do love him back. And that is also the harsh reality of life, that people can be really terrible spouses, but be really, but really dote on their kids. And those kids reciprocate that because they don't understand adult relationships. All they see is their father and
Mm,
their mother, right? And they see this very present father who loves them so much, who plays with them. And then they see this mother who is somewhat maybe distant, and they don't understand the
mm,
reason why. They don't even understand the connect. They don't make the connection to
mm.
their father,
But
right?
wouldn't something like that, like would a situation like that result in children that are very disturbed? Because I guess as they get older,
Mm-hmm.
they would fill in the gaps, and there would no doubt be situations where had she stayed, where they would have been witness to, if not physical violence, at least like harsh words or that kind of emotional abuse as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why I'm glad that the kids left while they were still
Yeah,
still young, and I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I'm sure that Nani that they'll grow to understand why their father is
yeah,
absent in their lives, because I do believe that he will remain absent in their lives, and they'll grow to understand that. But I also know of children who have grown up in abusive relationships. I mean, in families where their parents were in a toxic
mm,
relationship. And when they talk about their father, who was the
mm,
abuser, they it's almost as if that abuse, never happened,
mm. That's very
you know,
yeah.
and they've managed to, and I don't know if it's a coping mechanism that they
Mm,
pretend, that their father wasn't abusive to their mother. Like, it has never
mm,
come up. And when they talk about their father, he's a hero, and he's, and he did all of these good things with them, or he was their hero, and he did all of these good things with them. And they're very capable of distinguishing between their father as their parent, who was very nice to them and who gave them all of these opportunities, and their mother as their parent, who was very nice to them and, also did stuff with them, but never the two together. Like they never talk about their father as a husband or their mother as a victim or their father as an abuser. Never.
That's really interesting. And I guess it just kind of shows again like the vastness and the kind of different experiences that people face and the situations that can happen. Because I guess I know a lot of people who who either have witnessed or know that their father was abusive to their mother, but also they didn't have a relationship with their father because he wasn't interested in being a good parent. And so that's a really interesting exploration of, well, what happens when a man is abusive to his wife, but also does want to be a big part of his children's life and is very gentle with them and very good with them. Like, it's a very different situation and a really interesting exploration.
I've also known, people whose father was abusive to their mothers, was nice to them, but once they were old enough to, they just cut off from the father completely, So I don't think there's a template for how, people behave. I guess that people choose what works
and it
for
depends
them.
on the situation.
And some people are very good. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So obviously the book deals with a lot of themes and issues in society. And in some ways, I guess you hold up a mirror and you show us some of the more complex things that go on, especially with regards to sexual abuse and sexual abuse even within marriages, but patriarchy, Nigerian society more generally. And I believe for sure that you're not just showing us what happens, you're inviting us to think more deeply about things, to understand the multi-layered nature and how complex things are. But what are some of the things that you really wanted to bring out about the world and society and people?
Geez, that's a difficult question. I think perhaps that one of the things that, thinking about the book now, because I don't know that I was thinking of it as I was writing it, but thinking of it in retrospect, that I wanted to show is how if you're dealing with oppressive institutions or oppressive systems, it doesn't matter if one person or some people within that system are good, right? And are not oppressive. As long as that system is there, it would be oppressive to the people that is oppressive too. So, for example, Nani's father, Doda, was very progressive, wanted, didn't really care whether or not his children got married. Nani might have gone to him when she had issues, later in the novel, in the way that she couldn't go to her mother, and he would have supported her just sort of based on the kind of things that he, that he says and his actions before he died, kind of things that he said and his actions before he died, makes me think that he would have been a much different. His reaction would have been much different, and Nani might have felt that he would have heard her and helped her out, right? But the system remains what it is. Once he dies, Nani no longer has that support within that system. But if the system were different, if society were different, it would have worked for Nani, regardless of whether or not her father was alive. Yeah. So I think that was one of the things that when I think back, when I think about the novel, it's been one of the things that is foremost in my mind. That when we say, cops are, in the states that cops are corrupt, or that violence to black bodies by cops is problematic, it doesn't mean that it is every cop, right? But also when we say that patriarchy should be dismantled, it doesn't mean that every man, is oppressive to women. But it means that system doesn't work for everybody. And so regardless of, it doesn't matter that a few people within the system are good. Because once those people leave, then the people that they were protecting from oppression remain vulnerable to that
Exactly.
oppressive
And the person
system.
that has left the system will just be replaced by someone else who will uphold it.
By somebody else, yeah. And so when Dada dies, that's it. Nani becomes as vulnerable to the system as the people who don't have progressive fathers.
Absolutely. It has been so wonderful speaking to you today, Chika, and I feel like maybe I need to go back and reread the book after speaking to you. But not yet. I'm still too livid. Still too upset.
Thanks for that too.
Honestly, it has been such a pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for reading. There will be no writers without readers, so I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much to Chika for her time today. This was such an interesting conversation and I really enjoyed it. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.